there, hated the day. The day was a miserable day. I mean, it was a...
Really? I thought...
Well, was it? Well, I can tell you now, it was the worst royal engagement I ever did, a royal wedding I ever did, because Harry was determined to keep the newspapers away. For me, it was a disaster. And...
well, was that deliberate? You were made to feel unwelcome
I
at the
felt
wedding?
so. I felt... It wasn't just me, it was the whole of the British press. You know, they were, in many ways, badly treated. I think it was... Harry was angry.
I think it was a bit... Well, I think it was a little bit insolent. I think it was a little bit...
Can you imagine being at a royal wedding and realizing it felt less like a sacred family tradition and more like a badly directed Hollywood movie? That's exactly what legendary royal photographer Arthur Edwards went through. This man, who has been standing behind the camera at the most iconic royal events for nearly 5 decades, said it bluntly. Meghan and Harry's wedding was the worst royal wedding he has ever covered. Let that sink in. A man who witnessed Charles and Diana's fairy tale, who captured William and Kate's flawless union, who's been there for monarchs, funerals, births, and even coronations, he says Meghan and Harry's big day was a nightmare. And honestly, when you hear what went on behind the cameras, you'll see why. Because the world saw a polished, glossy spectacle on TV. But Arthur, he saw misery, chaos, and arrogance play out in real time.
Well, everything was done on long lenses. I mean, Akaito had an 800mm lens photographing the guests arriving.
He said it without hesitation. This was the worst. For someone who has seen generations of royalty walk down the aisle, who has photographed them in moments of joy and heartbreak, to hear him describe Meghan and Harry's wedding as suffocating, uncomfortable, and downright disgusting. It's shocking. Guests weren't basking in love and tradition. They were sweating, whispering, rolling their eyes, and wondering what on earth they had been dragged into. He described the scene vividly. Blazing heat suffocating the chapel, people fanning themselves desperately, makeup sliding off faces, gowns sticking uncomfortably to skin. Can you imagine? These weren't ordinary guests either. These were royals, dignitaries, people used to grandeur and refinement. Yet they sat there in misery, silently fuming as if they were extras in a show that cared nothing for them.
As they engaged for the job, was 5 feet away. You know, it was just hopeless. And then the carriage shot, when they went past me in the carriage, they looked...
Arthur Edwards left Windsor not just disappointed, he left disgusted. Disgusted that centuries of royal tradition had been trampled for Hollywood theatrics. Disgusted that a sacred union had been turned into what he calls a disaster. For a man who has always respected the monarchy, who has photographed its most defining milestones, this wasn't just another wedding. It was a betrayal. And before we go further, let's remember who Arthur Edwards is.
About Meghan, and quite rightly, some of the things that were said about Meghan during the engagement were pretty harsh. I want to sort of mention them now, but some of them were pretty unfair as well. And so he was angry.
Arthur isn't some gossip columnist with an agenda. He isn't a disgruntled outsider. He's been the royal photographer for The Sun since 1977. That's nearly 50 years of capturing the monarchy from the inside. He's traveled with them, shared their journeys, and built trust no outsider could ever dream of earning.
You know, I've done some really lovely royal weddings. I did both King Charles's weddings. I did William's wedding. I did.
This man has been there for it all. He captured Charles and Diana's magical wedding, Diana's heartbreaking funeral, William and Kate's perfect union, and even King Charles's coronation. 7 royal weddings, 5 funerals, 8 births. The living history of the monarchy has passed through his lens.
There were lovely occasions, but that today, I couldn't get out of Windsor quick enough, I promise you that.
The worst royal wedding to cover.
Yeah, and then when the baby was born, when Archie was born, that was another, in my view, a disaster, because I knew we was not going to get a picture.
And the royals themselves adore and respect him. William and Kate have personally thanked him. Harry himself once joked with him at photo shoots. Arthur was welcomed into the fold, trusted with sacred moments, not some random face peering through the gates.
William was born, and Harry was born, and George and Charlotte and Louis. We got great pictures outside the hospital, I remember, and William and Catherine especially.
So when he says Meghan and Harry's wedding was the absolute worst, that judgment carries weight. This wasn't rumor or clickbait. This was truth spoken by the man who stood right there, camera in hand, watching everything unravel.
The baby had been born many hours earlier. We were led to believe it was going to be a home birth, and it was at a hospital. There was that. the whole thing was just.
The first disaster, the heat. Edwards remembers the sun in Windsor beating mercilessly on guests trapped in the chapel. Women clutched their fans as if their lives depended on it. Makeup smeared, elaborate hairstyles wilted, and gowns that cost thousands became sticky, sweaty prisons. People were miserable, suffocating in silence.
Camilla in I think Munich, the first pictures of Archie that was taken by the press association. I mean, showing her on my phone, and she sort of, and that was the first time she saw him, you know. So
this wasn't the royal elegance the world imagined. It wasn't magic, it was survival. Sweat replaced sparkle, exhaustion replaced excitement. The atmosphere was oppressive, and Arthur swears it didn't feel like an accident. It felt deliberate, as though guest comfort never even crossed Meghan and Harry's minds. Hollywood glitz was prioritized over basic human needs. The image mattered more than the reality. Edwards, who had braved rain, wind, and countless ceremonies over decades, had never seen anything so miserable. What should have been a celebration felt like punishment, and the heat was just the beginning. The real insult? The seating. Imagine the outrage when royal veterans, family members, and loyal servants of the crown were pushed to the back while Hollywood celebrities, people Meghan and Harry barely even knew, sat front and center. Oprah Winfrey, who had only met the couple once or twice, was practically given a throne in the chapel. The Clooneys, who admitted they didn't even know the Sussexes well, were placed like royalty. Meanwhile, senior royals and decorated military veterans were shoved to the sidelines like afterthoughts. Arthur said it straight. This wasn't a wedding, it was showbiz. It felt like a red carpet premiere, not a sacred family celebration. Service, tradition, and loyalty meant nothing compared to how well a celebrity might photograph. Arthur even joked bitterly that he needed a GPS just to find his own seat. His view was blocked, his decades of service ignored. Hollywood elites strutted proudly in prime spots while whispers of disbelief rippled through the chapel. Everyone understood the message loud and clear. Family came second, image came first. The chaos didn't stop with the seating. No, Meghan and Harry had another target in mind, the press. And Arthur Edwards, along with his colleagues, felt the sting more than anyone. He described it as a calculated war, not just security protocol. The photographers who had spent their lives documenting the monarchy were pushed so far back they needed massive lenses just to capture simple arrival shots. They were humiliated, shoved into corners, while Meghan and Harry's own private photographers were given prime access just feet away. Arthur had seen his share of strict royal security before, but this wasn't safety. This was punishment. Harry, furious over the media's coverage of Meghan during their engagement, used his wedding day as a weapon. He wanted the press punished, and Arthur, standing there with his camera, felt the full force of that vendetta. The most iconic moment of any royal wedding, the carriage shot, wasn't spared either. Think of Charles and Diana smiling as the carriage rolled past. Think of William and Kate waving proudly to the crowd. That magical image becomes history, framed forever. But Meghan and Harry, they turned their faces away, deliberately. They denied the photographers the single shot that defines royal weddings. Arthur was crushed. He had captured Charles and Diana's carriage moment, a piece of history, but here, he couldn't get a single usable picture. It wasn't an accident, it was a snub, a message. The press wasn't welcome. The very people who had carried royal tradition into the public eye for decades were treated like intruders. And here's the chilling part. It worked. They transformed from duty-bound royals into global celebrities, from family members into media moguls. The monarchy gave them a stage, and they used it to build an empire, leaving destruction behind. For Arthur Edwards, who had seen it all, Meghan and Harry's wedding wasn't just the worst he'd ever covered. It was, in his words, the most calculated betrayal of royal tradition in modern history. Arthur Edwards couldn't shake what he'd witnessed. For a man who had dedicated nearly half a century to chronicling the monarchy, Meghan and Harry's wedding wasn't just a personal disappointment, it was a tragedy for the institution itself. He often compared it to Charles and Diana's wedding. That day, he remembered standing in awe, capturing a love story that felt larger than life. Diana's gown, the roar of the crowd, the sense of history unfolding. It was magical. Even William and Kate's wedding decades later carried that same balance of tradition and joy. Guests were honored, family came first, and the world celebrated a moment of unity. But with Meghan and Harry, he said it felt hollow. It was as if the entire event had been designed for cameras and headlines, not for hearts. Every detail screamed performance, from the seating chart that favored Hollywood stars over royal veterans, to the cold snubs delivered to the press, to the food that looked better than it tasted. Arthur saw it all as a deliberate shift, a shift from monarchy to marketing, and he wasn't the only one whispering. Behind the scenes, even seasoned guests who had attended dozens of royal events were shocked. People who had dedicated their lives to the crown left Windsor muttering that they had never felt so unwelcome. Arthur himself admitted that it seemed like the British attendees in particular were sidelined, as though Meghan and Harry wanted to send a message. The old ways didn't matter anymore. What pained Arthur most was how unnecessary it all was. Royal weddings had always been about blending tradition with joy. They didn't have to be stiff or outdated. William and Kate had proved that you could honor the past while embracing modern love. But Meghan and Harry didn't want balance. They wanted control. They wanted their wedding to be a stage for their brand, not a sacred ceremony rooted in centuries of history. And that control didn't stop at the wedding. It spilled into everything that followed. The Netflix deals, the tell-all memoirs, the relentless interviews. Arthur pointed out how every single scandal seemed to be monetized. Private pain was turned into public content. Family disputes became streaming gold. The irony wasn't lost on him. Meghan and Harry had cried about wanting privacy, yet they had never shared so much of their lives with the public. They didn't just pull back the royal curtain, they tore it down and sold tickets. Arthur described it as heartbreaking. For him, the monarchy had always been about dignity, stability, and service. But Meghan and Harry, he said, turned it into a spectacle, one that made headlines at the cost of family bonds. He recalled one detail that truly stung: Prince Philip's funeral. A moment that should have united the family was overshadowed by questions of whether Meghan and Harry would even attend, and if they did, what drama might unfold. Arthur found it appalling. Funerals, in his experience, had always been sacred ground where even feuds were set aside. But with the Sussexes, everything was theater, even grief. And the Queen, who had devoted her entire life to service, was left deeply hurt. Arthur revealed moments where her disappointment was clear. Moments when she longed to see her great-grandchildren but was denied. He said it was one of the saddest things he'd ever witnessed. A grandmother, a monarch, forced to watch family ties unravel on the world stage. For Arthur, it all traced back to that wedding. The signs were there, hidden in plain sight. The heat, the seating, the snubs, the food, the broken traditions. At the time, people excused it as missteps or oversights. But now, looking back, he saw it as the blueprint. Meghan and Harry weren't stumbling. They were setting the tone. Their wedding wasn't about joining the royal family. It was about breaking away. And while many sympathized with their struggles, Arthur couldn't ignore the wreckage left behind. The monarchy, he argued, survived wars, abdications, and scandals because of its ability to preserve dignity. But Meghan and Harry, in his eyes, had shredded that dignity for applause and profit. The saddest part? Arthur admitted that even after all of it, there could have been healing. The Queen, he said, left the door open. Frogmore Cottage was offered. Invitations were extended. Opportunities to return were always there. But Meghan and Harry didn't take them. They chose distance. They chose independence. They chose the brand over the bond. Arthur's final judgment was harsh, but it came from decades of loyalty to the crown. He said Meghan and Harry's wedding wasn't just the worst he had ever covered, it was a betrayal. A betrayal of tradition, of family, and of history. And perhaps the cruelest twist of all, it worked. They became exactly what they wanted. Global celebrities, free of royal duty, rich beyond measure, and endlessly relevant. They had, in Arthur's words, turned a royal wedding into a billion-dollar launch pad. For him, that's the ultimate heartbreak. He didn't just photograph a wedding, he photographed the moment the monarchy lost two of its own, not to tragedy, but to ambition. And that, Arthur Edwards says, is why he'll never forget Meghan and Harry's wedding, not for the beauty, not for the love story, but for the way it shattered everything a royal wedding was meant to stand for.